It's not laziness. It never was. The name they gave to your weariness is merely the most convenient mask for an older, silent process. While you blame yourself for not moving forward, invisible forces adjust the pace of your steps, define the reach of your desires, and teach you, with almost ritualistic patience, how far you can go without causing disturbance. Machiavelli would see this with disconcerting clarity. He would say that man is rarely inert by nature. He is molded to obey limits that he does not recognize as imposed. From an early age, the individual learns to confuse conditioning with identity. They learn what to expect of themselves, what is considered acceptable to desire, and, above all, what is dangerous to want too much. This learning does not occur through explicit violence, but through repetition. Small frustrations, conditional rewards, symbolic punishments. Little by little, the vital impulse is domesticated. The fire is not extinguished. It is reduced to a controllable flame. And when the force diminishes, the system offers a simple label: lack of discipline, lack of willpower, laziness. Machiavelli would never accept this superficial explanation. For him, inaction is not an isolated moral flaw, but the predictable result of well-designed structures. He observed that men become docile, not because they desire mediocrity, but because they learn that resistance is costly. The fear of exclusion, instability, and loss of security acts as a constant brake. The body remains active, but ambition is carefully restrained. Man works, but does not advance. He produces, but does not decide. He exists, but does not govern his own path. There is a deep tension here. If you are not lazy, why do you feel this constant weight when trying to change? Why does the idea of breaking patterns generate anxiety even before any concrete action? Machiavelli would suggest that the most effective conditioning is that which is installed before consciousness. It is not necessary to explicitly prohibit. It is enough to make the psychological cost of change high enough for the individual to give up on their own. Thus, control becomes invisible and, therefore, more stable. Through a more esoteric, almost initiatory lens, this process reveals something even more unsettling. Theosophy teaches that human consciousness can be expanded or compressed according to the symbols and narratives that surround it. Machiavelli, even without using this language, seems to operate in this same hidden territory. He understands that whoever controls perception controls movement. If you believe that your stagnation is a personal failing, you will never question the structure that benefits from it. Observe the world around you. How many live exhausted without understanding the origin of their burnout? How many carry guilt for not achieving an idealized version of success without realizing that this image was carefully constructed for the few? Machiavelli would see this as precise engineering. Keeping the majority busy, tired, and self-blaming is more effective than keeping them under surveillance. The man who blames himself does not rebel. He corrects himself, adjusts himself, diminishes himself. This is the central trap. When the individual internalizes failure as a character flaw, the system absolves itself. The structure disappears from view. Only the subjective burden of not being enough remains. Machiavelli would understand this as a refined form of domination, making the dominated defend the mechanism that limits them, believing that the problem lies exclusively within themselves. But there is a breaking point in this process. A rare moment when the narrative begins to falter, a vague feeling that something doesn't fit, that constant effort doesn't produce proportional progress, that life seems to run in carefully drawn circles. This unease is not weakness. It is a sign of emerging lucidity. It is the moment when consciousness begins to touch the limits of conditioning. Machiavelli emerges precisely there, not as a romantic liberator, but as an unsettling revealer. He doesn't offer immediate comfort. He offers clarity, and initial clarity almost always hurts. because it demands admitting that much of what you call choice was, in fact, adaptation, that many of your limitations were learned, not discovered, that your supposed laziness may simply be a symptom of a mind trained not to desire beyond what is permitted. This realization opens a dangerous fissure. If it's not laziness, then what else has been carefully installed without your consent? What other beliefs operate silently, defining the scope of your actions? Machiavelli doesn't answer immediately. He merely directs the gaze to where few dare to look, to the intimate relationship between power and conditioning. As this first movement concludes, a question lingers, not as an answer, but as an invitation. If you have been conditioned to restrain yourself, who benefits from this restraint? And more importantly, what happens when this question is no longer ignored? The journey has only just begun, and that which has been awakened no longer accepts returning to its comfortable state of slumber. There is a common, almost banal moment that repeats itself in the lives of millions of people. The alarm clock rings, the body awakens before the will, and for a few seconds there is an inner silence where everything seems possible. In this brief interval, there is still no fear, no obligation, no guilt, only naked consciousness. But soon the mind kicks in and, like an old jailer, reminds us what must be done, what cannot be risked, what is prudent to avoid. Machiavelli would observe this instant with surgical attention. He would know that there, in this small daily ritual, conditioning reveals its most refined work. The man gets up, completes tasks, answers messages, produces results. To the outside eye, he functions, but something remains stagnant, as if a vital part is always postponed. Many call this a lack of motivation. Others say it's just tiredness. Machiavelli, however, would see another layer. He would see a subject trained to confuse movement with progress, effort with power, occupation with freedom, and the busier he is, the less dangerous he becomes. Think of someone who dreamed of changing their life, not in a grand way, but simply changing cities, professions, dynamics. The plan existed, of course, but there was always a not yet. It's not the right time yet. I don't have enough confidence yet. I'm not good enough yet. These phrases seem prudent, almost wise. However, Machiavelli would recognize in them a learned pattern. Excessive prudence doesn't arise by chance. It is cultivated. It protects structures that do not tolerate unexpected ruptures. There's a mystery here. Why does fear come even before the attempt? Why exactly does imagination falter when it starts pointing towards something bigger? The answer lies not in an isolated trauma, but in a silent accumulation of everyday experiences. The boss who ridicules an unconventional idea. The friend who advises don't risk it. The family that values stability above all else. Each episode seems small, irrelevant, but together they build an invisible field where the possible is constantly diminished. Machiavelli understood that the most lasting power doesn't need to threaten. It only needs to teach limits. When an individual learns self-censorship, control is already complete. They begin to monitor their own impulses, to distrust their own ambition. And when they feel this internal resistance, they interpret it as a personal failing. They don't realize they are merely obeying a logic they never consciously chose. There are recurring stories in different contexts. People who work beyond their limits but feel guilty when they rest. Others who rest but feel guilty for not making progress. It's a perfect cycle of exhaustion and frustration. Machiavelli would see this as an efficient mechanism, keeping man always in debt to himself, always owing something, always falling short of an expectation that moves faster than he can. At certain times, something strange happens, an unexpected event, a conversation, a loss, or even a prolonged silence. Suddenly, the internal narrative falters. The individual realizes they are tired, not of acting, but of acting meaninglessly, tired of fulfilling obligations without deciding, tired of existing within invisible tracks. This realization doesn't bring immediate relief. It brings unease, because questioning conditioning is the first step in losing the illusion of security. Machiavelli would never romanticize this awakening. He knew that seeing the structure is uncomfortable. It means admitting that many sacrifices were not inevitable, only convenient for others. It means realizing that obedience was rewarded not with freedom, but with limited permission. And this realization generates a powerful internal tension: to remain comfortable in ignorance or to face the risk of lucidity. Observe how society reacts to those who break the mold. First comes bewilderment, then judgment disguised as concern. Are you sure? That's too risky. Why change now? These questions are not neutral. They function as subtle reminders that deviating from the expected path has a social cost. Machiavelli would understand this as a collective defense of the status quo, not out of conscious malice, but out of fear that the example will spread. Here a silent turning point emerges. When the individual realizes that their supposed laziness vanishes in the face of something they truly choose, the narrative begins to crumble. They discover that the energy was always there. What was lacking was not willpower, but inner permission. Permission to desire without apologizing. Permission to err outside the script. This discovery is dangerous because it returns to the individual something that had been carefully taken away: the real responsibility for their own destiny. Machiavelli offers no consolation on this point. He offers a mirror, and the reflection is not comfortable. It shows a man who can act but has been taught to wait, that you can decide but have been trained to ask for invisible permission. The question that echoes now is no longer, why am I like this? But who benefits from me continuing like this? And once that question settles in, the old label of laziness completely loses its meaning. What remains is a dense silence, laden with possibilities and risks, a silence where consciousness begins to reorganize itself. Machiavelli would know that this is the most delicate point of the journey, because from here on it is no longer possible to pretend that nothing was perceived. The conditioning has been exposed, and what has been seen cannot be forgotten. The next step will require something that few are willing to face: acting without the old excuses, without the old shelter of self-blame, confronting head-on the price of one's own freedom. There is a silent belief that is rarely questioned, that most people fail because they don't want it enough. This idea is repeated like a modern, almost moral mantra. Machiavelli would never accept this simplistic explanation. For him, the human will is not born free. It is molded, trained, and often domesticated even before it learns to desire on its own. What we call lack of discipline is usually just the end result of a long process of forced adaptation to structures that were not made to awaken greatness, but to maintain predictability. Notice how, from an early age, the natural impulse to question is corrected. The curious child is called inconvenient. The restless young person is guided to fit in. The nonconformist adult is seen as unstable. Machiavelli would understand this as social engineering applied to the spirit. It is not necessary to break the individual. It is enough to teach him to doubt himself. When this happens, control ceases to be external and begins to inhabit the mind, operating automatically and almost invisibly. The result is a man who feels desire, but neutralizes it before it becomes action. He imagines possibilities, but interrupts them with arguments that sound too rational to be questioned. It's not realistic. It's not the right time. It's not for me. These phrases function like keys that lock inner doors without making a sound. Machiavelli knew that the most effective power is that which does not need to impose itself, only to become logical in the eyes of those who obey. But if the will has been conditioned, can it be reconditioned? or is man condemned to repeat patterns he didn't even know he chose? There is a rarely discussed aspect. Conditioning not only limits action, it redefines pleasure. The individual learns to find satisfaction in small concessions, in minimal rewards, in distractions that provide relief without transforming. Machiavelli would see this as a refined strategy, offering enough comfort to avoid rebellion, but never enough freedom to generate autonomy. Thus, man occupies himself with temporary reliefs and loses the appetite for profound changes. In this scenario, laziness becomes a convenient label. It shifts the cause of the problem to the individual and absolves the system. If you haven't progressed, the failure is yours. If you haven't built something greater, it's because you lacked effort. Machiavelli would immediately distrust this narrative. He knew that intelligent structures always prefer to blame the subject's character rather than reveal their own mechanisms of restraint. It's safer to call someone weak than to admit that they were deliberately limited. There's an unsettling revelation here. Many people aren't afraid of failure. They're afraid of what comes after success. Real success disrupts relationships, shatters expectations, exposes envy, and creates new risks. Conditioning teaches that it's better to remain predictable than powerful, better to be accepted than sovereign over oneself. Machiavelli would recognize this fear as an inevitable side effect of living in structures that punish those who deviate from expected roles. Are you truly afraid of failing, or are you afraid of losing the position you've been assigned? When someone breaks this cycle, something curious happens. There is no immediate applause. There is silence, distance, discomfort. The group reacts as if an unwritten rule has been violated. Machiavelli would understand this as a collective defense mechanism. Whoever breaks free exposes, even without words, the imprisonment of others. And this exposure is intolerable for those who still need to believe that there was no alternative. It is at this point that an invisible yet decisive choice arises. Either the individual retreats, reinterpreting their audacity as a momentary error, or accepts temporary isolation as the price of autonomy. Machiavelli would never hide the cost of this decision. He knew that lucidity comes at a high price, not in physical pain, but in solitude, responsibility, and the absence of excuses. From this point on, there is nowhere left to hide. Here a significant shift occurs. The man realizes that his energy hasn't disappeared. It was merely directed towards maintaining self-restraint. He expended strength adapting, justifying himself, diminishing himself. When this energy is redirected, the sensation is almost strange, like recovering a muscle that has never been consciously used. Machiavelli would see this as the awakening of virtue, the capacity to act according to one's own nature and not merely react to imposed circumstances. What if what you call laziness is actually unconscious resistance to a life you didn't choose? This awakening doesn't come with clear instructions. There are no guarantees, no reliable maps. There is only a sharper awareness and a growing discomfort with the old passivity. The individual begins to see patterns where before they saw chance. They begin to notice how fear disguises itself as prudence and how obedience masquerades as virtue. Machiavelli would know that this stage is dangerous because it doesn't allow for an easy return to the previous state of comfortable ignorance. From this point on, something changes definitively. The old narratives lose their power. The old excuses sound empty. The label of laziness no longer convinces even my own mind. What remains is a naked, unadorned question, echoing insistently. If I am neither incapable, nor undisciplined, nor weak, what exactly is being asked of me now? And even more unsettling, am I willing to pay the price of finding out? There are moments in history when collective behavior changes without most people realizing it. Not because people have become different, but because the environment has been silently reconfigured. Machiavelli observed this with almost clinical attention. He knew that man does not act in isolation. He responds to the invisible incentives that surround him. When these incentives are adjusted, behavior changes, and the individual believes that the change came from within. This is how conditioning becomes consolidated, when it no longer seems imposed. A curious fact persists for centuries with unsettling precision. In periods of great political control, apparent productivity increases, but creativity plummets. People work more but dare less. Machiavelli would immediately perceive the paradox. Constant activity does not mean power. Man can be constantly busy and yet profoundly stagnant. The system learns to occupy his mind so that he never has time to question the course of his own life. Fatigue becomes permanent, and exhaustion is mistaken for laziness, when, in fact, it is the opposite effect. Stories like this repeat themselves across different eras and contexts. People who believe themselves to be unmotivated discover, upon radically changing their environment, an energy they had never experienced before. It wasn't a sudden burst of willpower. It was the lifting of an invisible weight. Machiavelli would understand this as empirical proof that human behavior is highly sensitive to the power structure in which it is embedded. When the structure changes, man changes along with it. This is not weakness. It is nature. There are also improbable events that reveal this logic. In situations of extreme crisis, when common rules collapse, previously apathetic individuals demonstrate unexpected courage, initiative, and leadership. The man considered lazy in normal times becomes decisive when the dominant narrative dissolves. Machiavelli would never be surprised. He knew that most of the limitations attributed to character are in fact adaptive responses to context that punish excessive initiative. Conditioning operates subtly. It doesn't say don't act, it says act only here. It doesn't say don't think, it says think within these limits. Over time, the individual begins to confuse obedience with identity. They define themselves based on the permitted boundaries. When they try to cross them, they feel guilt, anxiety, or a weariness without apparent cause. Machiavelli would recognize this phenomenon as a spiritual effect of power, the domination that affects not only the body, but also the perception of what is possible to desire. There is a rarely mentioned detail. Systems that excessively condition need to convince the individual that he is the problem. This transfer of responsibility is strategic. When a person believes he has failed due to personal incapacity, he does not question the arrangement that limits him. He tries to correct himself, adjust himself, reduce himself even further. Machiavelli would see this as a sophisticated form of political and social stability. Constant self-criticism replaces conscious rebellion. Notice how the word potential is used. It always points to an undefined future, never to the present. You have potential, they say, but you are not yet ready. This eternal promise keeps the individual in a state of waiting, working, trying, preparing, but rarely crossing the threshold of full action. Machiavelli would understand this dynamic as a temporal trap. Man lives projected into the future and loses sovereignty over the present. There are almost anecdotal accounts that illustrate this with brutal clarity. People who, after losing everything, report feeling paradoxically lighter, not because the loss is desirable, but because the collapse removed expectations, roles, and conditioning that they could no longer sustain. Machiavelli would never romanticize suffering, but he would recognize the effect. When the fear of loss disappears, energy returns. Man acts not because he is secure, but because he is no longer paralyzed. This is a crucial point in the narrative. So-called laziness begins to reveal its true face. It is not an absence of energy, but a forced conservation of it. The individual has learned over time that investing fully in oneself brings social, emotional, and symbolic risks, so he restrains himself, not out of conscious cowardice, but for adaptive survival. Machiavelli would know that no animal moves against a hostile environment without extreme necessity. Man is no different. As this understanding deepens, something shifts internally. There is no immediate euphoria, no sudden liberation. There is a lucid unease, a realization that many choices considered personal were, in fact, predictable responses to repeated stimuli. This lucidity does not accuse, it reveals, and every revelation carries a weight, the responsibility of not pretending not to have seen. From this point on, the viewer can no longer hear the word laziness in the same way. It sounds shallow, insufficient, almost offensive to the complexity of human experience. Machiavelli would be satisfied with this effect. He wasn't seeking intellectual comfort, but strategic clarity. When the veil falls, there is no innocent return. What remains is the silent question that begins to form, preparing the ground for what comes next. If conditioning explains so much, how far does my responsibility extend? And where does my real possibility of rupture begin? There is a decisive moment in every awakening of consciousness, the moment when understanding is no longer enough. Machiavelli would have known how to identify this moment precisely. It is when the individual realizes that continuing as they are is also a choice, and perhaps the most dangerous of all. Up to this point, conditioning has been revealed, exposed, almost laid bare. But now the real tension arises. What happens when someone clearly sees the chains that limit them and yet remains unmoved? At this point, the internal system reacts. Old fears reappear with renewed intensity. The mind produces more sophisticated, more rational, more convincing arguments. They are no longer crude excuses. They are well-formulated justifications. Machiavelli would recognize this as the last line of defense of conditioning. When brute control fails, internal persuasion comes into play. The individual begins to negotiate with himself, promising gradual changes that rarely materialize. Tension rises because something has changed irreversibly. Comfortable ignorance is no longer available. The individual knows that their supposed laziness was, in large part, an adaptation. They know that their energy hasn't disappeared, only been redirected towards maintaining invisible boundaries. Even so, acting involves real risks. Breaking patterns can mean losing approval, stability, relationships, identity. Machiavelli would never romanticize this moment. He knew that every rupture exacts a psychological price even before generating any external reward. This is where a silent twist occurs. The viewer realizes that the greatest obstacle is not the external world, but the attachment to the role they have learned to play. The persona constructed for survival begins to resist transformation. It whispers that change is dangerous, that staying is prudent, that acceptance is maturity. Machiavelli would see in this voice not reason, but fear organized in the form of logic. The narrative accelerates because the conflict becomes internal and immediate. It's no longer about understanding systems or structures, but about confronting one's own complicity. On some level, remaining conditioned offers benefits: predictability, excuses, absence of total responsibility. Freedom, on the other hand, demands constant presence, continuous decision-making, and the courage to err without support. Machiavelli knew that few desire this burden, even when they claim to want change. There are recurring reports of people who, as they approach a real transformation, experience a sudden and inexplicable fatigue. It's not physical exhaustion. It's psychic resistance. The body slows down, the mind wanders, motivation disappears. The old label of laziness returns with force, trying to regain control. Machiavelli would understand this as conditioning fighting for its own survival. It doesn't disappear without confrontation. At this stage, something needs to be sacrificed. Not time, not effort, but a fundamental belief that you are exactly who you've always been told you are. That's the hardest loss, because as long as the old identity remains intact, transformation will always be partial. Machiavelli knew that power begins when a man accepts to traverse instability without clinging to old definitions of himself. Tension reaches its peak when the individual realizes there are no guarantees, no promise of success, no assured future validation. Only the clarity that continuing as before is now a conscious decision. This recognition is uncomfortable, almost cruel. It eliminates victimhood without offering immediate comfort. Machiavelli would see this as a moment of strategic maturity, the moment when man stops waiting for permission to act. The pace intensifies because psychological time shifts. The future ceases to be a distant abstraction and begins to weigh on the present. Each postponement sounds louder. Each distraction reveals itself as an escape. The old narrative of laziness loses strength, but tries to reinvent itself with new masks. Now it's called caution, balance, patience. Machiavelli would recognize these masks. He knew that fear rarely presents itself as fear. By the end of this part, the viewer is no longer comfortable, and that's intentional. The groundwork has been laid for the final confrontation, the one that doesn't happen against the world, but within one's own consciousness. The question is no longer whether conditioning exists, nor whether it was effective. The question that pulsates, charged with urgency, is another. If I know I've been molded, to what extent am I willing to continue obeying a form that no longer represents me? There comes a point when all understanding needs to be transformed into action. Machiavelli knew that knowledge that doesn't translate into action becomes just another form of intellectual entertainment. Now, at the end of this journey, what is revealed is not a new theory, but a silent demand to take responsibility for one's own awakening. If you are not lazy, if you have been conditioned, then there is something that can be done, and that something begins in a less grandiose way than many imagine. The first practical application doesn't require external revolution, but relentless observation. Machiavelli would teach us to look at ourselves with strategic coldness, not guilt. Observe where your energy disappears, not where you say you want to act, but where you consistently avoid it. Observe the most elegant excuses your mind produces. They are clues, not flaws. Each recurring justification points to an internalized limit. Making these limits visible is, in itself, an act of rupture. The second step is to choose a small, yet real, point of conscious disobedience, not against the world, but against the automatic pattern. It could be a decision postponed for months, a conversation avoided, a project you always treated as impossible now. Machiavelli knew that power is not recovered all at once. It is regained through symbolic acts that re-educate the will itself. A single movement made without asking internal permission already begins to alter the axis of conditioning. There is a spiritual aspect to this that is rarely named. By acting despite fear, the individual breaks an invisible contract with their own passivity. It is not euphoria that arises, but alignment. The feeling is not one of immediate victory, but of inner coherence. Machiavelli would understand this as the restoration of virtue, the ability to act in accordance with one's own nature, even under uncertainty. This alignment is the opposite of laziness. It is presence. Another essential point is to review the environment. No awakening survives intact in a context that continually sabotages it. Machiavelli would never ignore this. Observe which stimuli drain your attention, which relationships reinforce your old identity, which habits keep you predictable. Adjusting the environment is not weakness, it is strategic intelligence. Man does not need to be stronger than everything. He needs to be more lucid than before. At some point you will realize something subtle yet profound. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses authority. It continues to speak, but it no longer decides. This is a silent milestone. There are no applause, no external confirmation. Only the inner certainty that you are no longer completely at the mercy of imposed narratives. Machiavelli would say that this is the true beginning of human freedom, not the absence of limits, but the conscious choice of which limits to accept. It's important to state clearly, this path doesn't promise constant comfort. There will be days of doubt, relapses, and a desire to return to the old role. This doesn't invalidate the process. Machiavelli knew well the instability of human nature. What changes is not the oscillation, but the direction. Even when you retreat, something within you already knows that there is another way to live, and this knowledge can no longer be erased. Now, look back for a moment. Remember how many times you defined yourself as incapable, undisciplined, or lazy. Remember how many times you accepted that label without questioning it. Notice the weight that this had on your choices. That weight begins to dissolve not because someone absolved you, but because you saw the structure behind it. And seeing is an irreversible act. The conclusion of this narrative is not an end, but a passage. From here on, every small conscious action becomes a reminder that you are not only a product of conditioning, but also an agent of your own reorganization. Machiavelli would be satisfied with this, not with grandiose promises, but with the emergence of individuals who are less manipulable, more attentive, and more responsible for themselves. If this content resonated with you, please like this video so that more people can access this reflection. Share your experience in the comments, even anonymously if you prefer, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of awareness, inner power, and philosophical clarity. Transformation begins in silence, but it strengthens when sustained.